In this lesson, we're going to talk about application controls. Now, application controls are just what they sound like. They're controls over the input, the processing, and output functions of applications. They're usually designed to make sure we have completeness and accuracy, as well as validating the entries that are made. Now, as an auditor, you should be looking for things like the ability for those controls to identification of as far as what components they work with, how they work with the flow of transactions to the system, how strong those application controls are they developed through a testing strategy, did they test those controls to make sure they actually worked, and did people look at or evaluate the test results. Now, an input control should make sure that every transaction is entered, processed, and recorded accurately and completely. Now, if you've ever gone and done any online shopping, you've seen some examples of input controls, usually written on the what we call the client side of that web application. That means, you open up a form and it says, I need your name and your address and, where credit card information. And if you type some weird thing for your date of birth or for your credit card number that doesn't look like a normal number, what does it do? It says, hey, that looks invalid. It says this has to be of a certain type. And that's, a type of input control. Now, input authorization's job is to verify that all the transactions have been authorized and approved by management. And some of the types of authorizations you might see are things like signatures on batch forms, online access controls, the use of unique passwords, again, maybe identifying the client workstation to make sure it's coming from an appropriate source that's sending me the information, and the source documents. Now, batch controls can group your input transactions and provide control totals. So types of batch controls you might see are things like a total monetary amount. That means, does the total of all the items I processed in that batch equal what I saw in the batch documents? In other words, did I get everything and do they add up right? You might have a total items type of control where it's going to look at the number of items that was processed and make sure that that is equal to the batch document. Or it could be total documents, which is the same thing, only instead of items, it's looking at numbers of documents. And then we have hash totals, where they're going to look at the totals in the batch and make sure that they equal those totals in the system. Your input controls should be able to verify that only the correct data is going to be accepted into the system and that any input errors are going to be recognized and corrected. Now, we have some choices about how we deal with input errors. It could be things like rejecting only the transactions that have the errors, or we might reject the entire batch of transactions. You could hold the batch in suspense waiting for the errors to be corrected, or you can accept the batch but flag the error transactions for further follow-up. In the control techniques, some of the things we look at are things like transaction logs. Now, I've talked about logs already. Transaction logs are important to us because it is a way of doing reconciliation. Right? I can look at a log and see who's been doing what or what actions have transpired, and I can compare that against what I see in the system. Obviously, we've talked about options for the reconciliation of data, basically a double checking of the values. We can look at any of the documentation we have with the controls. Error correction procedures, transmittal log, kind of like the transaction log, only what we're sending out, and whether or not we have any cancellation controls for source documents. Now, after the information has been input, the processing procedures should have controls to make sure that the reliability of the application's program processing is accurate. In other words, if you had a calculator and you typed 2 plus 2 and you hit equal and you got 5, something's wrong inside with the circuitry of that calculator, or you didn't learn math very well. We want to make sure that the program, right, the procedures that it goes through to do the processing is valid, that it's going to come out with the correct results. So your procedures should be created to make sure that the data is validated and hopefully as close to the time at the time in which it was input. Now, data validation is meant to be able to help you identify errors, incomplete or missing data, or inconsistencies among the data items. A lot of times, some of this data validation can be handled on the client side of an application. Again, I made the example of putting information into a web page form and having it looked at before, when you hit submit, and having it analyzed to see if it looks like it's going to be valid and that it's being validated as close to when you input as possible, which you hit the submit button. Your processing controls are designed to make sure we have completeness and accuracy on all of the data. Some of the following processing control techniques you can use are things like your own manual recalculations, verifying what comes out was what you expected, editing run-to-run totals, different types of program controls, reasonableness verification of the calculated amounts, maybe limit the checks on amounts or exception reports. These are all things we do to look at or view or control or verify the processing. It's important to make sure that you protect your data files. These are often your database tables. And your system controls will fall into one of four categories. System control parameters, which would allow only the system to be able to exercise changes on these files. Standing data means that often the master files aren't something that regularly change and maybe are only referred to during processing. Master data, balance data, would be running balances and totals that are updated by transactions, and something that should not be adjusted without approval. And you have the transaction files, which are controlled using validation checks. Your output controls are designed to provide assurance that the data that's delivered to the user is going to be presented, formatted, and delivered in a consistent as well as a secure manner. Now, there are several types of output controls. They're going to be things like logging and storage of sensitive and critical forms in a secure place. Should have computer generation of negotiables, instruments, forms, and signatures. Controls should control it, especially if it's something that's a financial instrument. Your output controls can work with report distribution, balancing and reconciling accounts and values. They can take care of output error handling, output report retention, and they should also be able to do the verification of receipt of reports. Now, when we talk about the business process control assurance, you got to remember that as an integrated application environment has controls, usually they're embedded and designed into the application to be able to support the business process. Now, those controls are usually some combination of management, programmed controls, or even manual controls. Some of the consideration of control assurance that you want to look into are things like, did they have a process map and controls? In other words, was there an actual plan about how the process was going to work? What risk assessment was done with the process? Did they have any benchmarking with best practices? Who is responsible? What are the roles and responsibilities? What activities and tasks are done? And are there any restrictions to the type of data that's going to be put in?